think probably the logical thing to do is to let Emil Olsen, who is based at the Royal Veterinary College, working again in neurology, move on and present his results, and then perhaps take questions about the two things together. That's right. I'll squeeze in here.
Might have to do a bit of walking illustration. Okay, so thank you. Firstly, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to absolutely nerd out on some of the gait analysis and talk a little bit about what I did during my PhD and the work we're doing now. So I know it's dangerous to come here and talk to the Brits about Milan Lab and football in Italy, but I'm going to do it anyways, partially to create some perspective on what gait analysis can do and what it has done in people. I'm also going to talk a little bit about lameness, because lameness has some advantages over the ataxic horse in terms of measuring it. And then I will, of course, talk about can we detect it and what have we learned so far in our studies. And then I'll move on to the future challenges. So the Milan Lab is so secret that you can't actually find any pictures on the internet of what is inside of that lab. So some of you may know that back in the early 2000s, Milan were successful in increasing the longevity of how long players could play and how long they lasted in football. Some people ascribe that primarily to what the Milan Lab were doing, and some people think that it was the changes in training that happened at that time. Manchester City has recently invested 150 million pounds, I think, in a similar facility, believing that it actually makes a big difference. And what Milan Lab and Manchester City are doing is that they're massively monitoring gait in their athletes. They're monitoring how they walk, how much they walk. They're monitoring the balance when they walk. They're monitoring their respiratory capacity. They're trying to look for things they can modify to make them last longer. And they're trying to look for things in the nervous system and how they can reprogram so that they don't create injuries. So it would be ideal if we could have a Milan Lab for horses and we could monitor young horses, monitor their gait, get a symmetry fingerprint, how symmetrical are they, how neurologically sound are they, and what happens over time with their gait in terms of coordination, and then modify and create exercises and create modifications in their gait so that we can train them and have them last longer. So now this is where, if you were a human going through a gait lab, there's lots of things that we can measure. So in people, you need a smaller facility than we do in horses. Here is a standard gait lab that has a bunch of motion capture cameras here. They record at 250 samples per minute. And then you can get people run through and they look with millimeter accuracy of the markers that are put on these athletes here and how they move from side to side. There are also maybe force plates in the floor here, and force plates measure force, so how much force you put into the ground. We'll come a little bit back to that later. And then you can look at symmetry and development over time, and again, what happens when you have an injury, what happens after you have done surgery, and you can adapt your rehabilitation to that. If you have a really fancy one, you can get all these outputs here that tells you there's lots of interesting things here. You can look at their speed capacity, how far they go in terms of what they should have for speed capacity, the vertical force, so again, how much force is put into the ground. You can look at joint loadings, and you can look at coordination between legs. So if we think about how that could be done in horses, we have to think about, one, taking horses into a lab is not super easy. These labs are not widely available to us. So we have to look at what has been done in the lameness world. Can you do me a favor and hit play on both of those two again? If they're only lame on one leg, so if they're lame on the front leg and they do as they're supposed to, they take their head up on the leg they're lame on. So in the lower corner here, this one is lame on the left front and the other one is lame on the right hind. That symmetry we can measure by putting sensors on the horses. So RVC has developed this equigate, and then there is the lameness locator that is also used widely that some of you may have heard about that in both systems, you put these little matchbox size sensors on the horses, and we get lots of information in terms of right to left symmetry out of it. And we get some wiggly lines, and based on those wiggly lines, we can measure exactly what is the symmetry fingerprint or the symmetry index of this horse, and what leg is it likely lame on. If they're lame on more than one leg, it gets kind of complicated, but we can also see what happens as we block them, and do they get more or less symmetrical after nerve blocks, or do they get more lame on a different leg? So these are kind of more logical manners, because a horse that's lame does the same with the same leg all the time, and we can measure that quite easily. Now that's different in the neurologic horse, because we've heard about how what happens in the nervous system is that the bone is pressing on the spinal cord, and the job of the spinal cord is to take care of activating and deactivating muscles when you're walking. Like when you walk down the sidewalk, why is it that you're walking so rhythmical? What controls that? And why does the toddler not walk rhythmical? Well, a big portion of that is the spinal cord. Probably up to 80% of that regular movement is taken care of by the spinal cord. So if you have a lesion in the spinal cord in the neck, well, we know you have an abnormal gait, but it's really difficult to measure that as easily as lameness. So we have heard about how some horses may be dragging their legs, they may be weak, some horses may be taking bigger steps, they may be overreaching, and so measuring those things are quite complicated, but doable. So in the past, this has been done a couple of times in some of the fancy gait labs. This is the RVC gait lab here, $250,000 pounds worth of equipment in here. There are some force plates in the middle here. There are some motion capture cameras out here at the side. We have a very nice long lab where we can have them go for really long stretches. And so you put these reflective markers on them, you have them walk over the force plates and through the lab. And so as they walk over the force plate, the information we get is up and down force. We get forces from side to side, so going out this way, how much force do they put into the ground out towards the side, and back and forth, so kind of back and forth like this. And that's illustrated by these three arrows here. And we get information on the markers. Now this is just a summary, so this is up and down force, just to get an illustration of how big forces we're talking about. And this is, the blue line here is back and forth force, and the little green line is side-to-side force. So what a study that Steve Reed was part of a few years ago, what they did is Yahara and that group looked at lame horses, normal horses, or horses perceived as being normal, and horses perceived as being ataxic, and they walked them over force plates, and they looked at what happened to the forces. And part of what happened to the forces is in the lame horse, this is not a surprise. When one leg hurts, you try to put less weight on it, and that's illustrated by less vertical force, so less up and down force on that leg that we can measure quite easily. And then you put more weight on the opposite leg, so that's also rational, because you have to distribute that weight somewhere. Now what happened in the neurologic horse is that, let's see, I'll move out to the side here. You can see that the lateral force, so the force into the ground and out to the side, is much larger in the ataxic horses here. And what they found is that the variation in that force, so from stride to stride, how much the horse puts in weight in lateral, so towards the side to stabilize its core, to stay on a straight line, to not be a drunken camel, that varies markedly for the ataxic horses compared to the lame and the normal horses. So actually, the force plates can be used, and we know that, fairly well to detect ataxic horses. Okay, so the other things that can be done in this fancy gait lab. So Richard already talked about our study. So all these horses that we looked at subjectively, we also walked them through the gait lab. And I'll talk about some of those results. Now, we use this scale. I won't comment too much more on it, but I don't put 5 on it in general, because I don't think that when they lie down, that's a gait. And then we looked at the movement of these markers. So what do you do when it like varies from stride to stride? I swear this is a horse, not a dinosaur walking through the lab. But this is markers on the hoof, on the fetlock, shoulders, and dorsum and head here. So what we looked at and what you can see, these wiggly lines here, most of what happens in terms of variation when you're walking happens when your foot is off the ground. So not on the ground, but off the ground. So when your foot is off the ground in swing phase, most of the variation happens. So what we looked at is, this is just up and down movement off the front fetlock marker here. And what we're looking at, this is when the foot is on the ground, and this is when the foot is in the air, so in swing phase here. And what we looked at was how much does the up and down movement vary halfway through swing phase. Kind of simple, but fits with what the neurologic horse that's not coordinating well should do. It should vary. We also, just to increase the variation, figured that probably if you take away their vision and their ability to stabilize their gait, maybe they would increase the variation in gaits. Okay, so if we use the median ataxia grade, so what the raters agreed, or what most of them thought was the true score of the horse, and we say that horses that are 0 and 1 are pretty mild. 0 is normal, 1 is very mild, and then 2 and upwards is kind of moderate to severe. And so we make a split in that and look at what happens to that up and down movement of the leg for the horses that are perceived as non-ataxic versus the horses that are perceived as ataxic. And we can see here that actually, not surprisingly, that up and down movement, the variation from stride to stride increases markedly. Now, what happens when we put a blindfold on them and measure them? So it's not surprising that the horses have an increase, the normal horses have a slight increase, or let's say moderate increase in variation here. However, the ataxic horses that have an impairment in their coordination, they appear to be markedly increasing that variation. That corresponds with what I feel we see clinically in these horses, and it also was quite obvious. We were very lucky that we did all of this indoor. Like, there was one horse out of the 24, 25 that were not too happy about it the first time. So we only got to do it 3 times in him, but otherwise all of them had this put on 5 times, walked through the entire lab, and they tolerated it extremely well. So this increase in variation for the ataxic horses with a blindfold is actually so great that it gives us diagnostic information, or at least really helps us support a way of measuring that abnormality. Okay, so yes, if you have a 200,000 to 250,000 pound gait lab in your backyard, then yes, we can get quite a lot of information already on this. You also need a full-time engineer or a postdoc or a PhD student to process these data, because it takes most of the day to analyze these data, to track the markers manually on these systems. Because in people, they have these fancy ways of analyzing it automatically that we don't actually have yet. In veterinary medicine, we may be able to make it, but that's another story. So back to the inertial sensors. So can we, putting these sensors on that we're using for lameness, what if we put them on the legs and we look at that up and down movement? Can we then measure it? I'll tell you next year. To be honest, I don't know yet, but given that with 95% certainty, I can follow how accurately how much those sensors move up and down, it is extremely likely that I can also use the sensors to get exactly the same information that we get from the motion capture cameras. So we have yet to look at those data, but it seems realistic that we will be able to detect that. And so we already know that ataxia is much harder to detect than lameness, at least for the internist. And in particular, when we measure these animals. So force plates and motion capture can detect ataxic horses fairly well. Blindfolding markedly increases the variation of gait, so it's helpful when you're evaluating horses to blindfold them if it's feasible and you think it's safe. And it really helps us when we measure the variation in their gait to look at horses blindfolded and unblindfolded and compare that. Okay, thank you very much.
One quick question, Steve.
So would you recommend blindfolding normal horses as part of the exam? Because I sort of stopped doing that, but seeing this, that variability, I'm wondering about doing that. You know, I've always used that elevation of the head, changing the horizon, but the fact that you change that variability, maybe the subtly ataxic horses, even without all the big lab, we could detect better by blindfold.
Yeah.
It changed my mind.
I guess it depends on, it would be interesting to do it for sure. I probably would, but I think that if the way we understand the nervous system is that you're able to compensate over time, so let's say you're looking at a horse that's been ataxic for a year maybe,
right.
And maybe it's learned. Maybe its cerebellum in its eyes has helped it integrate back to kind of way more normal gaits. So maybe.